Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, the Hellblazer podcast. And today we're reading issue 111. But before we get into that, just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we started a new story arc called Last Man Standing, where we met a new villain named Mirrodin, who is working with the government in order to destroy the old world magical sites that are all around Britain. We don't know exactly why yet, but that is what he's doing. And this has caused a bunch of people to come from out of the woodworks to stop him. Most notably, the Knights of the Round Table, or what's left of them, have gotten together to stop Mirrodin, which is actually another name for Merlin. But they've been waiting because they don't want to go against Mirrodin alone, because he's very powerful. And who they're waiting for is King Arthur, who has not shown up yet, and they don't know why. And because they've gotten impatient waiting for him, they decided to move on to another person who might be able to help them, and that is John Constantine. And at the end of the last issue, we saw the youngest looking knight, at least, of the Knights of the Round Table, wake John up in his room and tell him all this stuff. And John basically said, fuck off, I don't want anything to do with this. And that's where we left it off in the last issue. So first things first, with issue 111, we got the cover. We see Mirrodin with an evil smile on his face, and he's opening a briefcase towards us. And inside the briefcase is a very, very bright white light. And coming out of that is a bunch of stars. And then behind him, we see John Constantine is smoking and looking at him. And there's also a bunch of cattle behind John. And they're painted in red, so I'm assuming something bad happens to cows in this issue. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see we're starting exactly where we left off in the last issue, with Sanda, the blue-haired young man that is a knight of the Round Table, talking to John. Or I should say, they're not really talking as much as Sanda's just being quiet because he's stunned that John just told him to fuck off. And John, of course, is just smoking and leaning against the door, looking all cool. So over this panel, the narration says, "Now then, where were we? Ah, yes, confused as buggery. Bound to happen, mind, with all these ancient prophecies of doom cropping up around the British countryside. Once again, the vicious hordes of darkness, etc., bloody etc. It's enough to make the Pope smoke dope. To make matters worse, the less than triumphant return of the court of bloody Camelot seems to be happening right in my living room." We see a very dejected Sanda look down and say, "The dragon is back. He calls himself Mirrodin now." And John asks, "Who does?" And Sanda answers, "Mirrodin, Merlin, whatever you care to call him. He's real, John, and he's allied himself with some very powerful people." And John replies, "Let me guess. Vote for us and you'll make us fat." And Sanda answers, "Typical, isn't it? 3,000 centuries old, and he jumps straight into bed with the party of the future. Mirrodin has changed immensely. There was a time when I would have given my life for him, if that were possible. We were once the greatest of heroes, Eternals who had sworn the shaping of Britain from nothingness. We were its protection against the Saxons and from evil. And our head was Arthur, our king of rightful blood. And at our side was Mirrodin, the dragon. We had thought it would always be so easy, except something happened between Arthur and Mirrodin. A terrible argument that had been working its way to the surface for ages. Words and threats were exchanged. Mirrodin claimed Arthur had stolen from us. Arthur replied that we were blessed eternal and in no position to claim ownership of anything. Everything fell apart after that. Arthur left shortly after, and none of us saw him again. Mirrodin went off to die, or so we thought, and we waited, assuming our king would return if ever there were need." And during Sanda's story, he turned and looked out the window, and John came over to the bed and sat down, kind of to think it all over. And as John takes that story in, he looks up after thinking for a bit and he says, "I've seen him." And with surprise, Sanda turns and says, "Seen him? Where?" And John answers, "In my dreams. I mean, he shows up so often, says something enigmatic, and nips off, sharpish." And an overenthusiastic Sanda grabs John by the arm and asks, "What does he tell you?" And John looks down at Sanda's hand on his arm, kind of like if he's deciding if he wants to remove it forcefully or not, and he says, "How the fuck should I know? Probably lost his fucking sword, and checking off all the possible suspects." And Santa doesn't like that John's joking, and he says, "This is no joke, Constantine. You've never known a time as dire as this." And John looks him right in the eyes and says, "And you've never looked the devil in the eye and laughed in his face. So we're even, aren't we? Now fuck off." But Santa still tries to argue, saying, "Look, I can't blame you for not believing me." But he's cut off as John yells, "Yeah, well, congratulations, oh Grandmaster of the Bleeding Obvious." But right as John says that, all of a sudden something rushes past him, and it is the Knight of the Round Table that looks the weirdest, the one that's kind of like a moving shadow or static, and he actually hits John's cigarette out of his hand as he goes by, and John yells, "Ow! Bollocks! What the fuck?" But as the shadowy man stops in front of John, and John gets a look at him, he says, "Am I supposed to be impressed?" And Santa replies, "No, John. Convinced. In legend, my brother Skilty is called Lightfoot, who needed not use the road, for he was so swift that he could run across the treetops. And he can. He's been living here with you for the last 3 weeks, watching your every move. And while appalled by your hygiene, Skilty confirms you are the one to help us." And as John stares at the two Knights of the Round Table, his narration says, "My little inner voice, the one that never lies and that I always ignore, is screaming at me to turf them out on their respective ears, the simple-minded bastards. But I just can't help myself, can I? I mean, there's something about a 3,000-year-old naive twat that brings out the mothering instinct in my feminine side." So John answers, "I'll see what I can do. But if this ever shows up on candid camera, I swear I'll fucking drop you." Then Santa walks forward to John and he hands out a card and he says, "Skilty was right. You are a man of grace and honesty despite your rude exterior. Please, we'll wait at the place and time so written here." And as John takes the card, Santa walks past him, and also Skilty is gone. He's disappeared. And as Santa walks out the door, he turns to John and says, "May God bless you for your brave and honest heart, John Constantine." And then John looks down at the card that Santa gave him and says, "Yeah, all right, lads. And may the force be with you too." And we see on this page that the name of this issue is Last Man Standing, Part 2, No More Heroes. Then we turn the page and we cut to John and Danny, and they're hanging out outside with Cider and Rich is working on a project on his VW van, so he's on the roof, and John and Danny are sitting on the edge of the van inside where the sliding door opens. So from the roof, Rich leans down and he looks through the window upside down and says to John, "Fucking Wizard Merlin, man. Oi, con job. Chuck us that spanner, mate." And you might think that John just told him all the stuff about Merlin and everything, but I think it's just a coincidence that Rich has said Merlin. And I think he's talking about whatever project he's doing to the top of his VW van. He's just excited about the project, and he used the word Merlin to infer that it's magical. So in response to Rich asking John for a spanner, John turns around and asks, "What's a spanner?" I think he's being sarcastic because obviously that just means wrench. But John, as we know, is not one to get his hands dirty. So he says that and then just turns away from Rich and continues leaning against Danny as they smoke together. And over these panels, John's narration says, "A spanner. That's what I am for helping to agree someone I don't even know. When I could be here with my mates and my Guinness and my lovely lass, where everything's comfortable, despite all the banging and crashing from above, where I can almost get away from my cares for a while." And speaking of the crashing and banging above, we get a couple panels of whatever Rich is doing to the top of his van, and it looks like he's attaching 2 wooden planks that look like skis, and he's nailing shoes to them. So I think he's planning on strapping himself to the top of the van while he stands on these 2 boards like he's skiing. So that's the banging that John is hearing, the nailing of the shoes into these wooden skis. And over these panels, John's narration continues saying, "Course, it's Tuesday. So Rich is cooking up yet another new and entertaining little scheme. Remember Eddie the Eagle Edwards, that half-blind ski jumper who used to crash for Britain in the Olympics? Turns out, he's Rich's all-time hero, doesn't it? A couple of weeks ago, Rich, following some runaway train of thought to its illogical conclusion, decided to go into training as the world's first punk ski jumper, hence the current modifications being made to the poor bleeding Rama wagon. Now normally, I'd be up on the roof helping nail in some planks, happy enough to send my mate off to a broken bone or two. Normally." And as John's narration holds on that last word, we see John's face get kind of sour, and Danny turns to him and says, "John, what's wrong?" And John stands up and looks down at her and says, I've I've got some stuff going on, Danny. It's a bit hard to explain. I might have to go away for a bit so no one else gets involved. And then Danny stands up and puts her hand on John's chest and says, sometimes I look in your eyes and I swear I've never seen anyone so sad as you, John. I know you, always taking the weight of the world on your shoulders. I'm not your responsibility. Neither is anyone else here, hun. We can look after ourselves, okay? And just as she says we can all look out for ourselves, Rich yells out, tally ho! Look out below! And in the next panel, we see a pulled out view of what's going on with Rich, and he has laced up his shoes, he is strapped into these wooden skis, and he's holding out his hands like if the van was moving and he was getting a bunch of wind. And then John and Danny both look up at him and smile, and Danny says, referring to them being able to look out for themselves, even him. Then we turn the page and we cut to John standing in someone's room, and the walls are lined with books in here, and as John flips through one of those, we see a man who is working on a computer, and I don't believe we've seen this person before. He's a white man, maybe in his mid-40s. He's got a bunch of earrings and a big bushy beard and long hair and a ponytail. And I guess he's been at the computer for a while because he cracks the knuckles in his fingers, and as he does this, we see that there's a tattoo on each of his fingers. They're of letters, and they spell out on one hand love, and on the other hand hate. And he says to the computer, stand back, puny earthlings. These hands can kill at 20 paces. And as John looks up from his book and smiles at that, his narration says, good old Dez. I used to take the piss out of him something rotten. That was before cyberspace and reality merged into one, though. Now I'm beginning to appreciate the beauty of the World Wide Web, even though it means putting up with Dez's evil armpit odor. He lives for this sort of bollocks, the mad sod. Occasionally, we'll lose him for days on end, only to find him holed up in here, cataloging ghostly phenomena on the internet. Since I've had no worthwhile ideas of my own, I've brought all my available information to him, just to see if it sparks his creative juices. Then we see Dez reach down and grab something that printed on his printer, and as he stands up, he says, I knew it! I bloody knew it, them bastards! And John asks, what, you find some mucky pictures, mate? And Dez turns with a smile on his face and the paper in his hand, and he says, even better! What do you know about Dragon Energy Line? Then we see what's on his printout, and it's a map of Britain, but it has a bunch of red lines all over it. And as we see this, we get John's narration saying, Dragon Lines. Christ, what I don't know would fill a book. I remember some of it, though, from my days with Marge and Zed. There's a network of intangible but potent energy conduits that meander across the world, shaped by the contours of the land. Where dragon lines intersect, the energy wells up and emerges into the landscape, acting as a sort of psychic attractor. There are invariably old temples and standing stones built on a lot of these focal points, and we're drawn to these places without being aware of it. Then John smiles at Dez and says, sounds like science fiction. You've been reading The Watchtower again, Dez? So by the way John reacts to this news about dragon lines, it seems like he's trying to play it off like he's unaware of them, at least in front of Dez. But Dez doesn't like that John's not taking this serious, and he says, no, I'm dead serious, my son. And guess what? It looks like someone's trying to tear apart the entire network. On purpose. And then he hands John the printout, and then he sits down at his computer, and he points to the screen and says, check this out, John. I went and picked up a map of all the intersecting dragon lines across the country. It's all mapped out on the New Age webpage, right? Now, this one, from the Ministry of Transport, is a listing of all current and major roadworks being done across the country. Only, I've crossed the databases to see where the roadworks coincide with the dragon line intersections. And bingo! And what he's pointing to on his computer are exactly what he said and what you would think are these ley line intersections over top of a map of all the roads being built. And they line up so that the new roads are definitely going to be paving over all these sites. So Dez turns to John and says, I'll need to get some more files downloaded before I'm certain. But just imagine, John, pollution's a fucking conspiracy. And you know what governments are like, mate. They thrive on conspiracy. And with that, John doesn't say anything. He just folds up the piece of paper and puts it in his pockets, and then he walks out of the room. Then we cut to a children's playground, and there's a park around it where there's a bunch of trees, and standing amongst the trees, we see the Knights of the Round Table, and the one that has the facial deformity says, he's not coming. And Santa says, he'll be here, Afagdu. I know it. Constantine is not the kind to abandon such a just and noble cause. Then the old member of the Knights sees something and he turns and points and says, "There!" And we see John light a cigarette in a shaded area behind a tree, and then he comes out and says, "Very touching, mate. If I didn't know better, I'd almost believe your version of me." And then Sanda comes forward and asks, "What did you find, John?" And John pulls out the piece of paper from his pocket and he says, "Last week, your mate Meridian obliterated an old burial mound at Colchester, once known to the Romans as Camulodunum." And with a big smile on his face, John holds up the paper and says, "Or Camelot. He's trying to cripple your old power system." And the old knight says, Oh no! You see the insidious beauty in it. The dragon wants us to think he's looking for us, but he's not. He wants returned that which Arthur stole." And then the knights gather in a circle and begin talking amongst themselves. And they're not including John, and he asks, "What's going on?" And then Afagdu, the deformed knight, says, "By God, that's why he destroyed Sigurd's tomb. He's searching for it." And then John kind of pushes his way into the circle, and he puts his hand on the old knight's shoulder, and he says, "Listen here, sunshine. I did my bit, so now I get to hear what everybody else bloody knows for a change. What's Meridian doing?" And the old knight answers, "He's looking for..." And at that moment, the old man's head explodes, along with a couple other of the knights. And as John turns to see what happened, we see there are two men with guns drawn, and they look like the security guys for Mirrodin. And John has like brains and stuff spattered all over his face from the old knights, so he's still in shock, and also he hates guns. And one of the gunmen points the gun at John and says, "You, stay still." And then he grabs John and he shoves him against a tree, and John yells out, "Oh, fuck!" And then a car pulls up, and they pull John towards it, and we see the second gunman still looking at all the dead bodies of the Knights of the Round Table. And as John is being pulled towards the car, he says, "Steady on, mate. I'm coming, all right?" And the second gunman, who was looking at the bodies, turns and follows John and says, "Shut up." Then John gets shoved into the backseat of this car next to Mirrodin, who is sitting also in the backseat, and he turns to John as the door closes and says, "Take heart, Mr. Constantine. Arthur's men are eternal. Despite their assured agony, they cannot die. Unlike you." And as usual, John puts on his stern face and he says, "I take it you're Mirrodin then. I hear you've made some pretty interesting friends, mate. You sure you can handle it?" And Mirrodin replies, "One does not get to be as old as I, Mr. Constantine, without getting to know everyone and everything about them. Your aging politicians grasp into power with all of their being, for fear that they will lose it, along with everything else when they die." And John snaps, "Very perceptive. So what do you want me for then?" And Mirrodin answers, "I'm looking for something." And John cuts in, "Aren't we all?" And Mirrodin says, Yes, I suppose we are. It's a box, and you are going to help me find it. I suppose you will want to know why. It's a very old story, Mr. Constantine, that I want you to hear. It begins in the beginning." Then we turn the page, and we get a bunch of scenes of what he's talking about in this story. We get some panels of a garden, then we get a panel of some cavemen-looking guys, and over these panels the narration says, "In the beginning there was nothing, and then there was something from which God began to fashion his creation. Where he held the world in his hands, the pattern of his touch was imprinted and flowed across the earth. From that energy, we emerged, his first children. You cannot imagine what it was like to live in Eden. We were eternal, like our Father, and so very blessed. God loved his creation and told us so each day. We had no reason to think this would ever change." And in the first panel, we're seeing, like I said, a garden that is supposed to be Eden, and there's two glowing beings that are walking in the garden. And the narration continues. "Until suddenly, without warning, we awoke on paradise to find our God had abandoned us in favor of mortal man. Mortals had no magic, no energy. They could not even hear his voice, and yet he loved them more than us. Despite our cries of protest, we were forsaken." And these are the panels where we see the cavemen walking, and in the background we see these illuminated beings walking off into the sunset away from the humans. And Mirrodin's narration continues. "Many years later, God revealed the reason for this, the secret of his touch. To Arthur, a mortal given immortality, whom I once trusted. Arthur took his knowledge, and he hid it from us, and never once did God raise a hand to stop him. And in this panel, we see a man looking into a glowing box. So that's probably Arthur, and the box, which is actually very reminiscent of the box that Mirrodin found in the last issue, is supposed to be this secret knowledge. Then we come back to the car, and Mirrodin is saying, God forsook those of us who were eternal. He gave us this paradise, then he took it away, and he never told us why. Then the car pulls to a stop, and John says to Mirrodin, so the dragon lines, you're saying they're God's fingerprints? And the box is the key. And then Mirrodin interjects, which you call the Grail, Mr. Constantine. Then one of the security guards gets out of the car, and he opens the door for John, and as John exits the car, he asks, why can't you get it then? But Mirrodin just replies, this conversation is over. You will use your connections, and you will find the box for me. And John fires back, why should I? And then Mirrodin reaches down, and he takes a plastic bag from the seat, and he throws it towards John on the ground, and he says, take a look in the bag, Mr. Constantine, and mark my words very carefully. I can get to any of your people at any time I wish. Consider that the next time you open your mouth to ask a stupid question. Then the car drives off, and John bends down to look at the plastic bag, and as he opens it, he drops the bag on the ground, and one of the hands of Dez, the one that says hate, falls out of the bag bloody. Then we turn the page, and we cut to John Constantine sitting on a bench in a park in the rain. And he's holding his head in his hands like maybe he's crying. And in the narration over these panels, John's narration is having a conversation, I guess with itself, but it's like he's talking to Dez. And it says, Watcher Dez, long time no see. How you doing, mate? Not so bad, John. Not so bad. Yourself? Just fine. To what do I owe the pleasure then, John? I brought some people by, Dez. They're going to kill you, just to get to me. Sorry, old son, but that's what happens when you hang around me. Fair enough, John. I understand. Cheers, Dez. And since you won't be needing your hands anymore. And with that last line, a very distraught John looks down at his hands. Then from behind John, someone says, John Constantine. And startled, John turns around, and he sees the face of Jack of the Green looking at him from a tree. And Jack says, Hello, John. It seems that you and I must talk. But John just turns back around and says, Get lost, Jack. And then he stands up and he begins to walk away from the tree. And Jack says, Wait, I know what has happened, John. 'Tis always the way with the dragon. I reckon he wishes to destroy the energy lines, to remove the Prince of God's touch, so that God must relinquish his hold upon this world. And this is a cool scene because as John is walking, Jack of the Green's head is kind of appearing in each tree that he passes. But John is not saying anything. In fact, it looks like he's trying to ignore Jack. And Jack says, Mirrodin cannot do this without the box. And John looks up at him and says, So what? And then he tries to move away from the last tree of the park, but Jack of the Green grows big and blocks John's path and says, Stay, John Constantine. Listen to me, I beg you. So John pulls out a cigarette and he lights it and he says, You've got 10 seconds. So Jack says, Without God's touch to protect you, John, I think mortal man will surely die. But Eternals and mortals are intertwined. As Albion's energy is disrupted, old spirits awaken. We are unprepared for this change of cycle, and it's destroying us. The box must be recovered, not for Mirrodin's gain, but for eternal and mortal alike. My people can help recover it. And John looks up pleadingly, almost like he's about to cry, and says, I can't, Jack. I just can't. And then Jack's body drops down from the tree, and he puts his hand on John's shoulder, and he says, Oh, John, you are not expected to be our savior, and I meant not to give that impression. Our fate lies in the hands of another. You know him, John. All you need to do is ask him for us. But John turns and actually begins running away from Jack, and he says, No, there's always a catch. Leave me alone. And Jack yells, Wait, John, there is more to understand. The Grail may only be held by a king of rightful blood, but these current kings and queens of Britain, they are the imposter children of imposters. The bloodline of Arthur was lost from mortal awareness centuries ago. It is one of the secrets kept at Abaton. Our rightful king lives among you, and you were right about him. He embodies the essence of our land. And then with some annoyance, John turns around and says, Oh, for fuck's sake, who then? And then we see Jack walk up to John, and he tells John something, and John's face looks startled. But we don't hear the name. We just get John's narration over this panel saying, And then he tells me. And just when I think I've heard it all, I'm reminded of how little I really know. Then we cut to somewhere else this night, and it's not raining anymore. We see Rich's VW van driving through some cow pastures, and he is locked into the top of it with those shoes that are nailed to those wooden skis. And as the van drives over a bunch of cow pies, we cut to the inside and we see one of John's friends say, "Watch it, Mupp. Mind the fucking cow shit, eh?" And John's crazy-looking friend Muppet is driving, and he's got a big smile on his face, almost like he meant to hit the cow shit. Then we cut to the top of the van where we see Rich is having a blast, and he's yelling, "Ha! Warp speed, Perry Como!" But then suddenly, the van stops, and we hear the two guys inside yell out, "Look out! Shit!" And as they slam on the brakes and come to a stop, the wooden planks break off, and Rich flies forward in front of the van. But it seems he's okay, because as he gets up from his knees, he begins laughing, saying, "Far out and sod it! Said the seagull rides again!" Then John just kind of appears out of the darkness in front of him, and Rich looks up and says, "Fucking hell, Conjob! Where were you, mate? You missed it!" But John looks down seriously and says, "We need to talk, Your Majesty." And with that reveal that Rich is in fact the bloodline of King Arthur, that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So we'll have to wait until next time to see the repercussions of that reveal. But if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.